Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Lawrence, Director of the Center for Livable Future, and I'm delighted that you're here today for the 13th Annual Edward and Nancy Dodge Lecture. And it's a great privilege to welcome Malik Yakini to the Bloomberg School of Public Health and to Baltimore. Before I introduce Malik, let me just say a couple of words. First of all, this will be live streamed, and so we will be, during the Q&A, having some questions tweeted in. And those of you in the audience, if you're into that thing, the hashtag, oh, it's not shown yet. The hashtag is JustFoodCLF. Immediately following the lecture and the question and answer period, we'll be having a reception out in the courtyard where I'm sure a lot of you would like to greet and welcome Malik to the school and to Baltimore. And we will be having an all vegan reception, so if you haven't sampled some of the wonderful things that our CLF-connected caterers provide, you're in for a treat. The Dodge Lectureship was established in 1999 to honor Dr. Ed Dodge, who is right as we speak teaching at Africa University in Zimbabwe, where he has for the past 4 years been a volunteer faculty member every spring. And he sends his regrets, especially to Malik, but to all of us. Ed was an MPH class of 67, and he wanted to honor his late wife, Nancy, by supporting an annual lectureship at the school. We've had a distinguished group of people that are mentioned in the program, and Malik Yakini's presence adds to the luster of that group, and we're really thrilled that each year we can attract an outstanding person to come and talk to us about food security, equity, sustainability, and a livable future. I heard Malik Yakini speak at the James Beard Foundation Award Ceremony a year ago when he was honored for his work. And I thought, as I sat listening to him, we've got to get him here one way or the other, and the Dodge Lectureship seemed an ideal way of doing it. Malik is an activist and an educator, committed to freedom and justice for African people in particular, and humanity in general. He's the founder and the executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, which operates a 7-acre farm in Detroit. It has also spearheaded efforts to establish the Detroit Food Policy Council, where Malik and our own Ann Palmer have worked together in the past. Malik chaired that Food Policy Council from December 2009 until he was term limited out of his chairmanship last May, but continues to serve. He's also on the steering committee of Uprooting Racism, Planting Justice. From 1990 to 2011, he served as the executive director of the Nsaroma Institute Public School Academy in Detroit, one of the leading African-centered schools. In 2006, he was honored as Administrator of the Year by the Michigan Association of Public School Academies. He has served as a member of the Board of Directors of Timbuktu Academy of Science and Technology from 2004 to 2011, and he's the Chief Executive Officer of Black Star Educational Management. The late Martin Luther King used to talk about the arc of history being long, but that it bent toward justice. And I think, as we're about to hear, Malik Yakini is one of those people who is leaning hard on that curve, bending the curve more sharply. He's dedicated to working to identify and alleviate the impact of racism and white privilege on the food system. He has an intense interest in contributing to the development of an international food sovereignty movement that embraces black farmers in the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa. He views the good food revolution as part of the larger movement for freedom, justice, and equality. Malik has presented at numerous local community meetings, national conferences on food justice and implementing community food security practices. He's featured in the book Blacks Living Green and the movie Urban Roots. He's currently an Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy Food and Community Fellow and a Business Alliance for Local Living Economies Fellow. He recently received the James Beard Foundation Leadership Award that I mentioned. He's a vegan, an avid organic grower, a musician, drummer, bassist, guitar player, but today he's here to talk to us. So Malik, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Baltimore. How's everyone doing? I always begin when I have the opportunity to speak before an audience with giving praise to the Creator, because for me this is a spiritual work, and I know people have various paths and various ways in which they recognize the energy that gives order to the universe, and I respect all of those paths and all of those ways of knowing. But again, for me this is a spiritual work, so I always have to begin with that. And secondly, I have to begin with acknowledging my ancestors, both those who are shared collectively by African American people and those who are in my particular bloodline. So I say those things because it allows me to be bold and fearless when I know those forces are with me and flowing through me. So I'd like to thank Dr. Lawrence and Mia and the rest of the staff of the Center for a Livable Future for the work that they're doing here at Johns Hopkins, and also for inviting me. I always really respect people for inviting me to speak, because I don't operate by scripts and people don't know what I'm going to say. And so I appreciate them having the guts to give me a microphone and webcast this and not knowing what I might say. And sometimes I don't know what I might say. So I want to thank you all for attending as well. I'm sure there are many other things that you could have been doing today, and I want to thank the people who are watching this live webcast as well. I also recognize that there's many people that make events like this happen. So I want to recognize the people who are working the sound, and the people who are doing the video, and the people who prepared the food for the reception afterwards, and the people who grew the food for the reception, and the people who set the food up and served it, and all of the workers who make all this stuff happen, who are behind the scenes, who never get the accolades. So if you can please put your hands together for all those folks. I want to give a special big up to all the growers, all the gardeners and farmers. If you're a gardener or a farmer, throw your hands up. All right. We want to give it up for them. I was in Mali several years ago, and I met an elder who told us, he said, you have to go across the road and greet the farmer. And he said, the reason you have to greet the farmer is because it's those who work in the sun who make it possible for those who work in the shade. And so our lives are totally dependent upon those who grow food for us. So I always like to big those folks up and give them accolades and encourage them to continue doing the work that they're doing. And then finally, I want to greet my friend Eric Davis, who has come and visited us in Detroit, and who works for the Baltimore Health Department, and is a kindred spirit in this work. If you don't know him, I would encourage you to get to know him and see how you can connect with the work that he's doing. So it's an honor to be part of this lecture series with such luminaries as Vandana Shiva, Marion Nessel, Winona LaDuke, and my friend and teacher Wayne Roberts. And so just to be considered within the kind of the same, to be mentioned in the same sentence as them is a great honor. So I want to bring you greetings from Detroit, where a few weeks democracy was put into a deep coma. And I don't know how much you know about what's happening in Detroit currently, but About a month ago, the governor of our state appointed an emergency manager to the city of Detroit whose powers supersede those of the elected officials. And so essentially we have a dictator in Detroit right now, and whenever we have the chance to speak around the country, we always want to make people aware of that fact that democracy has been seriously undermined in the city of Detroit, and effectively the vote of the people of Detroit has no clout at this point, because there's one individual appointed by the governor who can supersede all of the decisions of the mayor and the city council. And we think that's significant that this is happening in Detroit at this time, and that if it goes down in Detroit, that it may go down in your town next. So I also have to say, though, that always in the face of oppression, there's always resistance, and there's great resistance in Detroit to this injustice. People who are doing things like slowing down the freeways. 3 cars will drive side by side and slow down, so they slow down and obstruct traffic so that business can't proceed as usual, and there's all kinds of protests. And so I'm glad to be part of that tradition of resistance in the city of Detroit. I also want to bring you greetings from the organizations that I represent, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, which I serve as executive director of, and the Detroit Food Policy Council, which I am a proud member of and formerly served as chair of. So having said all that, how many people like stories? Okay, and I know this is like a prestigious lecture at a prestigious institution, but I want to tell you a story called The Little Red Hen. And I call this a classic story retold because I put my own little kind of twist on this. By the way, this is a participatory story, and for those of you who are identified as white, I'll just say within the African American cultural tradition, we have something we call call and response. And so y'all have to participate too. Is that all right? Okay. So you'll figure out when it's time for you to participate. Once upon a time in a village in Africa, a hen scratched about the yard until she uncovered some grains of wheat. She called to her neighbors and said, "If we plant this wheat, we can have bread to eat. Who will help me plant it?" "Not I," said the cow. "I thought slavery was over." I always have to explain this too, okay? I know people don't like laughing about slavery, so everybody's like straight face right now. But my experience has been that anytime you're working with African-American youth in a garden or a farm, within the first 15 minutes, there's some reference made to slavery. "I thought slavery was over. You treat me like a slave. You're working me like a slave." So that's what that, I know jokes aren't funny if you have to explain them, but that's what that. "Not I," said the goat. "It probably won't grow anyway." "Not I," said the duck. "I'm much too busy." "Not I," said the lamb. "I don't do dirt." "Then I will," said the little red hen, and this is where you join in. You say, "And she did." After a few months, the wheat grew tall and ripened into golden grains reaching up to the sun. Beneficial insects returned to the village, and beautiful birds began to return as well. The little red hen again called out to her neighbors, "Who will help me harvest this wheat?" "Not I," said the cow. "My stomach's ache." This is admittedly corny, okay? "Not I," said the goat. "I don't really get involved with groups." "Not I," said the duck. "I have a wheat allergy." "Not I," said the lamb. "My favorite rapper, Young Shepherd, is performing in a free concert this afternoon." "Then I will harvest it myself," said the little red hen. The hen carried the wheat back to the house and asked her neighbors, "Who will help me grind this wheat into flour?" "Not I," said the cow. "Oh, I know you. What's up?" "What's up, Molly? You all right?" "Not I," said the cow. "I already have 2 jobs." "Not I," said the goat. I don't have anyone to watch my kids." "Not I," said the duck. "I'm trying to get paid." "Not I," said the lamb. "You running game, hen. You trying to pull the wool over my eyes." "Then I will grind it myself," said the little red hen. After resting from the exhausting work of grinding the wheat, the little red hen made one last attempt to solicit the help of her neighbors. Who will help me make this flour into dough and bake the bread? She was met with the usual litany of excuses. Not I, said the cow. Chewing cud takes all the energy I've got. Not I, said the goat. My kids have music lessons. Not I, said the duck. This is really corny here. My cousin Donald and his family are visiting from out of town. Not I, said the lamb. I'm studying for my real estate license. Then I will bake the bread myself, said the little red hen. As the aroma of the freshly baked bread drifted out into the village, the little red hen's neighbors began to gather outside of her door. Who will help me eat this bread? Asked the little red hen. I will, said the cow. I will, said the goat. I will, said the duck. I will, said the lamb. No, you won't, said the little red hen. None of you practiced ujima, collective work and responsibility. However, my beloved neighbors, I didn't grind all of the grain. I started a seed bank to have wheat for next year. Here's a handful of grain for each of you, and she sent them packing. As the little red hen sat down to enjoy her still warm bread with honey from the beehives that her friend Abba maintained at a local farm, the cow, the goat, the duck, and the lamb called a meeting to form an organic, sustainable farming collective. The next season, they all worked together to plant, harvest, and grind their wheat and bake bread. There was plenty for all. They donated some to the animals who were homeless or sick and sold surplus at farmers markets in neighboring villages. Their village continued to prosper and eventually started manufacturing farming equipment and baking equipment. The little red hen was elected chief of the village council. Y'all can clap. That's the end of it. So there's a lot involved in that little story, and I often like to start talks with that because it's humorous, and it gets people kind of relaxed before I hit them with the and start talking about white supremacy. So that's a little strategy. You know, when I first started talking to groups that were majority white people, all the white people just like sit and look at me with a straight face. And I didn't know if they were like trying to jump on me when I left out or what. So now I've learned, you know, keeping a little light at first, prepares people for what's to come. So we have a food system in this country that I'm sure most of you know. Sometimes it's categorized as the industrial food system that has all kind of practices that are really harmful to the environment, produces food that in many cases is harmful to human beings. And for many human beings, they don't have access to good, healthy, clean food. And so many people throughout this country are involved in the efforts to create a more sustainable, more just food system. And I'm one of those, and the organization I represent is one of those many organizations doing that work. And for whatever reason, the stars seem to have aligned in terms of this food movement. It's getting lots and lots of traction, all the way from the First Lady at the White House down to every community that I have a chance to visit. There's community gardens and farmers markets and CSAs and food policy councils and folks all around this country who are really gravitating towards this food movement as a way not only of creating greater access to fresh, healthy food, but also as a way of creating justice and equity in the society in general. So our organization says that we have to lead with values. And so in addition to the sustainability part of this, in terms of the agricultural practices, I'm not really going to focus on that today. There's lots and lots of information about that. And we support sustainable agricultural practices. In fact, at our farm, we use all organic practices. And that's not the only way to grow sustainably, but in fact, some people say organic is not enough. But we do use organic practices and beyond at our farm, and we are supporters of that. But mainly what I want to talk to you today is the human side of sustainability. Because no matter how many techniques and practices that we use that are sustainable, if we don't have justice with the human beings who are forming this food system, then we'll still have an unjust and inequitable food system. So the majority of my talk will focus on that. So again, we think that we need to lead with values. And foremost among those values has to be justice and equity. Oftentimes, we hear people making arguments that while they would like to see justice and they would like to see equity, that expediency dictates, is more important, or that that profit is more important. And so we say that nothing is more important than justice and equity, and that always has to be in the forefront. That has to be the lens through which we view our work. In addition to that, we think that we have an opportunity through this food system, through this food movement that we're creating, to create a new model of democracy. And when I say a new model of democracy, I'm not talking about just electoral politics, whether you vote for Tweedledum or Tweedledummer. If there's any, there's some good politicians. I suppose there's a few. My experience, and what I'm talking to you about today is from my experience. Admittedly, it's not objective. It's from my own subjective life experience. And my subjective life experience has been that most politicians are self-serving, and that even those who start out good somehow become corrupted in the process. Because it's a pretty nasty process, actually. So that's not the kind of democracy I'm talking about, although that's important too. But I'm talking about more people's democracy within our organizations on a grassroots level, how we begin to build organizations in a way that everyone has a voice. And so our organization is really grappling with that. How within this nonprofit world, how we still create a structure in which all of the members and all of the supporters of the organization help to decide what happens, and we don't have these top-heavy organizations and these hierarchies where people on the top are making all the decisions and the majority of people don't have a say-so on what happens. And so as we build this food movement, we have to have democracy as one of the leading values as well. The other value that we think is important is a Kiswahili word, which is called kujichagulia, and that Kiswahili word means self-determination. And so one of the values that we uphold is that communities have the right to determine what is in their own best interest, and they have the right to decide on the systems that will provide the goods and the services that they need. And that no other community has the right to come into communities and dictate to them how their communities should proceed. So that is a right and a value that we uphold without apology. Finally, the value that has to be in the forefront of everything that we do and has to be kind of the glue that holds all of this together is love. And so we have a love not only for ourselves as individuals and for our families and our community, but we have a love for humanity. And even going beyond that, we have a love for creation. We are part of this fabric that makes life on this earth, and we're part of the fabric that makes life in the universe. And so we're moving into a new age of human consciousness, which recognizes that human beings are not the center of life, and that we were not put here to dominate the planet and to dominate the animals that we coexist on the earth with. We were not put here to dominate the plants, but that we live in a symbiotic relationship with those other life forms. And in fact, that the earth itself is alive. In Western science, they would suggest to us that plants, animals, and perhaps some one-celled beings are the only life forms, and that things like rocks are not alive. I would challenge that way of viewing life and suggest that from the African and from many Eastern philosophical systems, that even things like rocks that we would consider to be non-living objects actually are alive. And that, in fact, everything is composed of the same thing. Donny Hathaway had a song in the 70s that was called Everything is Everything. And I think, I've been kind of interested in Eastern science and Western science and where those two things converge. And in the Eastern world, they tend to look at life, what I call from the inside out. They start with the spirit and then look at how that manifests in various ways within the world. And in the Western world, they tend to look at the material world and break it down to its most finite part. And they're really good at that. And so what we find is in the Western world, when they break things down to their most finite part, they're beginning to say now that everything is actually energy when you look at things on the subatomic level. And in the Eastern world, they say that everything is spirit and that it's just spirit manifesting at different rates of vibration. So this love that I'm talking about is this love that comes from understanding that everything is everything and that we're really part of the whole, and that we have the responsibility to be good stewards and good guardians of the whole, and to live in a way that respects all of life and that shows a love for all of life, all of creation. And so that has to be in the forefront of everything that we do. So there's some real serious structural barriers to creating this just and sustainable food system. And one of those barriers is the fact that we live in a system of unbridled capitalism, where profit seems to be the driving force for everything that happens in this society. And I would suggest, well, let me say clearly, I'm anti-capitalist, okay? I'm speaking for myself. That's where I'm at. I don't think it's a good system for human. You can clap. Don't be ashamed to clap. If you're anti-capitalist, he's clapping like. I don't think it's a good system for human beings. And, you know, as I've gotten older, I've realized that nothing is all good and nothing is all bad. You know, as I was young in my 30s, I used to, you know, have some like real extreme thinking. But I'm realizing now as I get older that everything has good and bad in it. Everything, there's duality in everything. And so, I mean, sure, there's some elements of capitalism that have contributed to the advancement of humanity, but it's far too many elements in the capitalist system that cause people to be oppressed and underdeveloped. And so we live in a system that, as the Occupy movement pointed out to us very vividly a couple of years ago, where 1% of the population controls the vast majority of the wealth. In fact, that 1% of the population has more wealth than the rest of the population combined. And so there's a real serious imbalance there, and it creates a governmental structure and creates policies that benefit the very rich and underdeveloped the rest of us. And so the food system, the broken food system that we have, is in many ways a reflection of an economic system that doesn't really serve human beings very well. So it creates sharp class divisions, and those class divisions are one of the factors that determine who has access to good, clean, healthy food and who does not. And so in Detroit, where I'm from, in a city of 713,000 people, there are no national chain supermarkets in the city. When I was growing up there were at least 6 or 7 national chains. But if you go outside, just to the border, outside of the city, to the mostly white suburbs surrounding Detroit, there is one of the most vibrant food systems in the United States. There's all kinds of options. And so one of the factors that determines that is class. It's not the only factor. Race is clearly another factor that I'll talk about more extensively later. But class is one of the structural barriers that we have to having a just food system in the United States. We have this persistent problem of poverty in core cities throughout the United States. I was here a year ago visiting my cousin who was being treated across the street in Johns Hopkins Medical Center, and had a chance some days when getting lunch to walk through the neighborhoods and saw the proliferation of drug use and folks hanging out on the corner selling drugs like it's an open-air supermarket. And, you know, similar situations exist in Detroit and other cities throughout the United States. And those situations are driven by poverty. And so the United States government has never really been able to effectively address this question of poverty for so many people in the United States. And so this is also a symptom of this unbridled capitalism and the class divisions that it creates. So that's one of the main structural barriers to creating justice. We have in cities like Detroit intentional disinvestment in the core city areas and the reinvestment of that money in suburbs. In Detroit, after the 1967 rebellion, each month after that, and that occurred in July of 1967, each month after that, tens of thousands of white people left the city of Detroit and moved into the ring of suburbs surrounding Detroit, and took with them, of course, the tax base that they provided, but also many of the businesses that they worked for also left the city And so there was this intentional disinvestment in Detroit over a period of decades. You know, many people blame Detroit's problems on corrupt political leadership, and that certainly is one of our problems. But by the time Kwame Kilpatrick and other black politicians assumed the mantle of leadership in Detroit, the problem was already very pronounced, and it was primarily a problem of disinvestment. The city trying to operate the same number of street lights, plow the same number of streets, keep the same number of parks, grass cut with less than half the tax base, an impossible task. Under capitalism, the poor become markets for oftentimes cheap and inferior goods, similarly to in a colonial situation where you have the so-called mother country, maybe England or France or Portugal, who produces goods that they dump into these colonies, and they become markets to produce profit for the mother country. And so we find in cities like Detroit, where the core city is predominantly African American, and other cities throughout the United States, we have a similar situation where we're seen as markets to dump these often inferior goods. And then we have the problem of capitalism always needing more and always having to expand. And so now capitalism is expanding into what we call the commons, into the areas that used to be controlled collectively, such as public schools and such as public lands and the various public services that municipal governments provide. And so now we see those being taken over by private concerns, and again, profit becoming the driving force as opposed to the public welfare being the driving force. All of these are symptoms of a decaying capitalist system that is one of the huge barriers to an equitable food system and an equitable system in general. Another of those major barriers, though, is gender. And I often like to tell people that I am a reforming chauvinist. And I say reforming because I am still in process, and the women that are around me help me to know that I'm still in process. And I'm thankful for that. And one of the reasons I talk about this, and I own that, is because later as I talk about white supremacy, I don't want the white people in the audience to think I'm attacking you, because that's not what I'm doing. And so just as it's almost impossible to be a man in this society and not be infected with patriarchy and chauvinism, it's impossible to be a white person in this society and not be infected by white supremacy. And so by owning my own stuff, I'm hoping that you also will own your stuff. So in many communities, such as the one I live in, women are the bedrock of the community. And in many organizations doing this food work, women are the bedrock of the work that's being done in urban agriculture and in food system reform work. So we have to lift that up and honor that. And in fact, throughout the world, the majority of farmers are women, particularly in so-called developing countries, where often men will go into the cities to gain employment and women are left in the rural areas to maintain the farming. So we have to honor that and honor the role that women have played historically in agriculture. We still have the phenomenon in American society where women have unequal pay for performing the same or similar jobs. And we have the phenomenon of not really honoring the critical role or valuing the role that women play who might be working in the home or who might be raising children. We don't see that as having the same value as people who go out into the external workforce. And so in all those ways, the role of women in society is devalued. But even, I don't want to say more importantly, but equally as importantly, when we don't honor the feminine energy, and it manifests in terms of gender in women, but the feminine energy runs through all forms of life. I mentioned that duality earlier, and it also runs through men. And so by men not recognizing the feminine energy within inside of us, we can't be whole either. And I would assert that one of the reasons we see so much war in the world today is because we have too many men in leadership. So I was a terrible chauvinist in my 20s. And so, I'm reforming still from that. And I realize in retrospect that oftentimes I should have listened to the women in my life instead of trying to be macho and assume that men know And so that's a real sickness that, to the men in the audience, I'm kind of challenging you to engage yourself in a process to overcome that so that we can all be more whole. So in addition to class and gender, the other big way in which inequities and injustice manifest in this society is race. And we live in a society, in fact, we live in a world where we have a global system of white supremacy, which is rooted in history. And I don't have a lot of time to go into great detail right now, but you probably know that beginning in the 1300s with Prince Henry the Navigator from Portugal, people from Europe began exploring the rest of the world. And initially they would come to places like West Africa and trade with the inhabitants and try to create relationships that seemed to be based on mutual respect. But that relationship soon deteriorated, and people of West Africa and then eventually people of the rest of the world were either seen as sources of free labor, as markets, or as inhabitants of lands that contained resources that those European countries wanted for their own development. And so because of this exploitation of the lands and the people of color around the world, a myth was created that white people were the best thing since sliced bread, and that there's this hierarchy and that everyone else is somehow under people of European descent. And so the vestiges of that thinking still continue. And this was thinking in the highest academic academies, by the way, right? This was not just, buffoons on the street. This was, scientists and, and great philosophers who held many of these beliefs that Europeans had this manifest destiny that they were to go out and conquer the rest of the world and civilize the rest of the world and bring Christianity so that the savages could be saved and what have you. So vestiges of that thinking still permeates the society in many ways that we often aren't aware of. Accompanying this myth of white supremacy is Eurocentrism, this idea that looking at the world through the eyes of people of Western Europe is the universal standard. And so if I were to say to you, name a classical musician, typically people would name people like Brahms and Beethoven and Bach, because we have been tricked into believing that classical music automatically means Western European classical music. The specific has become the universal. We've been tricked into believing that, into naming days of the week after European gods and goddesses, and just not even thinking about it, just assuming that that's just normal, and that, it's normal to name a day after Woden or after Thor or after Fry, and, that's universal, that everyone should do that. But perhaps even more harmful is this idea that European standards of beauty are the universal standard of beauty. And that particularly has a devastating impact on people of color. Throughout West Africa, we have black women who are getting skin cancer because they're bleaching their beautiful black skin because they value lighter skin over darker skin. Or we have black women throughout the world who are pressing and perming and in other ways desecrating their beautiful hair in order to make the texture of their hair more like Europeans' hair, because that has become the universal standard of beauty. And I've known that about black folks for a long time, but a few years ago I had a chance to go through a dismantling racism training where there was some Asian women in the training and some Latina women in the training. And I learned that this isn't just something that affects people of African descent, that in Japan the number one surgery is surgery to remove the folds from eyes so that the eyes look more like the eyes of Europeans. And in Latina communities, many women are dyeing their beautiful dark hair blonde to imitate this kind of Nordic standard of beauty that has been spread throughout the world. And so that's a real serious problem when people dislike the skin that they're in and dislike the God-given characteristics that they have. So many of us still have colonized minds, both the people of color and people who would be identified as white in this society. So this construct that we call race is a social construct. It's not a biological reality. And there's enough information now through the Human Genome Project and other projects to know that human beings share millions of genes, and the things that separate us one from another are very few. So race is not a biological reality, but it is a social construct that we have to contend with. And it's an evolving concept. It's not a static concept. The idea of whiteness is not the same now as it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Some folks have been let into the white club. They weren't white originally. Irish, for example, they were let into the club. And the definition of what it means to be white has changed. At one point in time, if you had one drop of African blood, you were considered to be black. And so these concepts have evolved over time. So again, it's a social and political construct. It's not a biological reality. This idea of race has caused people to subordinate their ethnicity. And so many so-called white people, they've taken on the mantle of whiteness and really know little about their ancestors. They know little about the specific ethnic group that they're a part of, because now they've kind of taken on this more general term of being white. And so it has lots of devastating impacts. It manifests personally in terms of what we call, for people who have white skin, internalized superiority. This idea that, that somehow that you're more privileged, that you have better ideas, that your standards are somehow higher than the rest, and that everyone should adhere to those. In terms of African people and other people of color, it manifests in terms of what we call internalized racial oppression. And I talked about some of that when I talked about the standards of beauty. But that internalized oppression manifests in many other ways. It manifests in us often feeling like we are not capable of controlling our own lives or capable of defining what happens in our community, and that somehow people with lighter skin have some exclusive monopoly on defining reality. Racism also manifests in systemic and institutional ways, and that it manifests in all major institutions in American society, in educational institutions, in medical institutions, in the criminal injustice system, in the food system. And in those systems, it manifests in terms of policies and practices that often aren't couched in racial terms, but still have impact, which is devastating to people who are not white. I want to talk about some of the steps that we might use to move towards what some of us call ma'at. Ma'at is a concept that comes to us from the ancient Kemetic people, or the people that we've been taught to call Egyptians. Europeans have a bad habit of going to places throughout the world and renaming things and renaming groups of people. And so we've been taught to call the country in Northwest Africa Egypt, but that was not the name that was used by the indigenous populations. They used the names either Tameri, the beloved land, Tawi, which meant the double land, the two lands, or Kemet, which meant the black land. And so in Kemet, this idea of Ma'at, which was represented by a woman with a feather on her head, and in the Papyrus of Ani, one of the popular papyri that we're familiar with, there's a judgment scene in which a scribe had passed on to the land of the ancestors, and his heart was weighed on a scale. The heart was on one side of the scale, and the feather of Ma'at was on the other side of the scale. And so the object in life was to live a life that represented these attributes of Ma'at, which sometimes are condensed to the ideas of truth, balance, righteousness, reciprocity, justice, and harmony. And so what I want to share with you are some steps that we might use to try to restore Ma'at on the earth in regard to this idea of race and racial injustice. And the first is that we all have to be involved in personal work. We all have to really look at ourselves in a very introspective way. And as I mentioned earlier, we are all impacted by the system of white supremacy, whether you are a so-called person of color or a person who identifies as white in this society. And so we have to look deeply at how we've internalized some of these false concepts and begin the process of undoing that thinking within our heads. But also, individuals don't transform in isolation. We do it in concert with others. And so it's important to be part of groups that are involved in this transformative process. And often it's important to be involved with groups of people who have similar life experiences to you. And so people of African descent have a particular experience with white supremacy and need to work in groups together to heal from that experience. People who are white have a another type of experience, but need to work together with each other to help collectively heal from the damage that's been done by white supremacy. I highly encourage people to be involved in some type of anti-racist training. There are many groups throughout the country that do anti-racist training or anti-racist training, such as the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans, or DR Works, which is based in Georgia, or the Crossroads Anti-Racist Training, which is based in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And by going through this intensive training, often you're able to see layers of this racial construct that we don't normally see, and to begin to look at how we can begin to deconstruct those. So it's not about blame and shame and pointing fingers at people and all of that. That really doesn't do any good, but it's about trying to develop ourselves as whole human beings, and for people who identify as white, beginning to become good allies to people of color as we're trying to create a just society. We all have the responsibility of challenging systemic and institutional racism and Eurocentric domination. Specifically within the food movement, these are some recommendations that I would make that we need to look at in terms of how we create a racially just movement. Because if we're going to create a just food system, we have to create a just food movement that's bringing that system into being. And so one of the things that we need to do is we need to identify and lift up the stories of Black and people of color leadership who are doing food movement work. Unfortunately, the face of the food movement is usually a young white woman. And I think it's great that young white women are doing this work within the food system, but they're not the only ones doing the work. And I have the opportunity to travel across the country. I was in Asheville, North Carolina last week, and was surprised to learn that there are Black folks in their communities and housing projects doing gardens and doing urban agriculture work that we just don't hear about. And so we need to identify those leaders and those projects and lift those up so that they're in the national spotlight. And the same with other people of color-led projects. We need to support projects such as Growing Power's Growing Food and Justice Institute, which is working on addressing systemic racism within the food system and within the food movement. We need to support efforts such as those of Cynthia Hayes and the Southeast African American Farmers Organic Network, SAFON, which has more than 200 farmers in the southeast part of the United States. We need to support groups such as the Federation of Southern Co-ops, which has worked for decades to create equity within the food system. We need to create support efforts such as those by LaDonna Redmond, who had a major conference last year called Food Plus Justice Equals Democracy, and is now launching a national effort called Food Justice Now. We need to support the efforts of Kelvin Gredick in Hamilton, Georgia, who's reviving the West Georgia Farmers Co-op, where farmers can work together and aggregate their produce and begin to refarm land that they had abandoned. And finally, we need to support the efforts of people like Maria Whitaker, who is forging ahead on creating a national Black food and agriculture organization. We need to support the efforts of scholars such as Dr. Monica White, Kwasi Densu, and Owusu Bandele, who are lifting up and researching the stories of Black agriculture and reclaiming some of the information about Black foodways. And we need to support similar efforts by Latino and Latina and Native American and Asian American food system scholars who are lifting up those stories. We need to build, within people of color-led organizations, we need to build our own internal capacity and reach deeper and broader into our own communities. Within those organizations involved in the food movement, at every conference we have, and there's conferences every week throughout the United States, I can almost do nothing but travel from conference to conference. There's so many conferences on food throughout this country. Every food conference needs a track of workshops on racial equity within the food system. Within food movement organizations, there needs to be a prioritization of the hiring of people of color, particularly at the executive levels. The staffs and the boards of food movement organizations need to reflect the communities that they're working in. We need to support efforts like those of Cheryl Danley in Michigan, who is working very hard to go to traditionally Black colleges and universities and other organizations that support people of color within the food system and recruit them into the sustainable food movement. Because folks like Monsanto, I can assure you, are at food conferences recruiting, trying to glean off the best and the brightest. We need to bring them into our movement as well. We need to replicate those efforts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we need frequent and mandatory anti-racism training in all groups doing work within the food system. Funders play a critical role, and I would say that currently what's happening is that many times funders who are predominantly white tend to fund those people who look most like them, who speak most like them, who know the people that they know, who act the way they act, and so that continues in inequity in organizations. So many times the organizations led by African Americans and other people of color are underfunded because the lion's share of the funding is going to these large white-led nonprofits. Funders need to reassess their grant making and employ intentional strategies to build the capacity of these organizations led by African Americans and other people of color. I had actually a 30-minute PowerPoint that I think I have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to like run through this PowerPoint. 15 minutes? Oh, okay, I have 15 minutes, so I don't have to go into hyper speed, but I'll still move a little quicker than I had intended to. So can we get the PowerPoint up? Just click on. Okay. This one here? Yeah. Okay. Close the whole thing. And then double click on your faucet. Okay, all right. There we are. Play. So I represent the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, and I just want to big up Molly, who's from Detroit and was doing excellent work in Detroit and is here in Baltimore doing. Throw your hands up so they know who you are. And I have much love from the city I'm from. And even though it's devastating and has become probably the poster child of urban decay, those of us still there have this fierce allegiance and fierce love for the city of Detroit. So we made lots of contributions, including the Motown sound, the assembly line style of auto production, which is probably a mixed blessing given the impact that the internal combustion engine has on the environment. And we've had artists like Betty Bebop Carter. But also it reflects much of what's wrong with post-industrial American cities. We had 2 million people in Detroit in 1950, and according to the 2010 census, we have 713,000, 81% of whom are African American. The unemployment rate in Detroit fluctuates between 20 and 28%, and the mayor of the city said in some parts of the city is probably closer to 50%. Between 1970 and 2000, there were 161,000 dwellings destroyed, with many more awaiting demolition. That's left 103,000 vacant lots in the city of Detroit, about 60% of which are owned by the city itself. So there's tremendous blight in the city, but also many of us see that as tremendous opportunity. I mentioned to you earlier that as of 2007, when Farmer Jack closed its stores, all of the major national chain supermarkets have left the city. There is a Whole Foods opening soon. Which will probably serve well one of the areas that's being gentrified in the middle of the city that they've renamed Midtown, but it won't serve the rest of us very well. And I'm not anti-Whole Foods. You may see me shop there every now and again. What's not often talked about is that 40,000 Detroiters have their water shut off. And so it's almost ludicrous to talk about food security if people don't have hot and cold running water. Now, in all fairness, these are the official statistics, because you might know that in communities like the one I live in, when utilities get shut off, people find all kind of creative ways to bypass the official systems. So in Detroit, usually after the water department comes and shuts people's water off, about 15 minutes later, some brothers roll up in a van and say, for $25, I'll cut it back on. And I'm not advocating that people disobey the law, but I do think it's your human right to have water. And they do sell water keys at Home Depot if anybody's interested. So the response of the organization that I serve as executive director of is what I want to talk to you about for the remainder of the time I have. We were started in 2006 for 6 purposes to influence public policy. Now, while we are unapologetic self-determinationists, we think that people should do as much as they can do on their own to improve conditions in their community. We also think that the government has a responsibility to behave in a responsible manner. And so policy plays a role. And so in Detroit, we want to influence the policy in regards to food. So that was one of our purposes. We think urban agriculture is not a panacea, but it also can play a significant role in improving life and creating a vibrant community. That was our second purpose, encouraging cooperative buying. We're not only concerned about food production, but we're concerned about how food is bought and sold. And so we have in Detroit, even though we don't have national chain supermarkets, we do have a series of smaller stores, many of which, not all of which, but many of which sell inferior food. Some sell outdated food, and in many cases, the clerks in the stores treat people with contempt and disrespect. But those store owners usually don't live in our communities, and so those stores are what I call wealth extraction stations. We go to the stores and we purchase things, and the profits from those go out to the suburbs surrounding Detroit, and they're not used to build up the communities from which they make their profits. So we think that cooperative buying is a better strategy that we need to look at and we need to implement. We think healthy eating habits are important. We're being killed in many cases by the food that we eat, and particularly in African American communities and other communities of color. There's devastating health impacts as a result of not having access to good, clean, healthy food. We facilitate mutual support and collective action among our members, and we encourage young people to go into food-related fields because we realize that this movement has to be an intergenerational movement. I kind of came of age in the late 60s and 70s, and so I was and am still part of what some people call the Black Liberation Movement, or it's called various other things. But in the 60s and 70s, we thought that this was going to be a very short-term proposition, and that maybe within the next 2, 3, 4 years, it was going to be a radical transformation of American society. And while the reality is that possibility did exist, and had it not been squashed by J. Edgar and the boys and COINTELPRO, there might have been that radical transformation, but in many ways, that kind of understanding of how society transforms was very short-sighted. And so we realize now that any significant movement has to be intergenerational. And so we can't have all people with gray in their hair and their beards running the movement, but we need young folks in their teens, in their 20s, and their 30s who are stepping up to the leadership if this movement is going to be sustainable. One of the things that separates our group from the many groups in Detroit, and in all fairness, I have to say that there's many, many organizations in Detroit doing this work. And so the organization I represent is just one of many. But the thing that separates, or that distinguishes our group, I should say, from many of the other groups is the belief that we hold and the practice that the most effective movements grow organically out of the populations that they're designed to serve. And so effective movements are not imported into communities or imposed on communities, but they grow out of the desire for the residents of those communities to see a better life, and the development of strategies by the people in those communities to address the problems that they're faced with. We have several programs. The Food Warriors Youth Development Program services about 200 children in 2 Detroit schools and 1 church community center. And we teach them about sustainable agriculture and teach them to look at the food system in their communities with a critical lens so that they can really begin to understand why, they buy food from gas stations in their communities, and why there's only foods in styrofoam containers and cans and cardboard boxes in stores in their communities. We also have a cooperative buying club, which right now is a once-a-month co-op where members can purchase food from a national distributor at below retail prices. And we're working very hard to morph that into a brick-and-mortar retail food store. In fact, that's where a great deal of my time goes right now, in that effort to create this retail grocery store. And again, the cooperative model allows for community ownership, which we think is extremely important, and it allows for a way of circulating wealth within a community in a way that develops that community instead of just creating stores like Walmart or other huge big box stores that come in and may provide access to food, but extract the profits from the community and still leave us without community empowerment. We also have a lecture series called the What's for Dinner lecture series because we realize that providing access to good food in and of itself doesn't necessarily change people's eating habits. People are very emotionally attached to the foods that we eat. And we've had several decades now of people eating fast foods and highly processed foods. And so many of our food ways have been lost. And so, you know, some of the gardeners in the audience can probably tell stories such as the experiences I've had where you give people fresh beets or fresh eggplant and they say, well, what do I do with this? Because we've lost much of that. You know, our grandmothers perhaps knew how to prepare those foods, but many of us don't. And so public education is an important part of the work that we do. We also provide leadership in an effort called Uprooting Racism, Planting Justice, which was formerly called Undoing Racism in the Food System, because we do realize that racism is a continuing problem within the food movement and within the larger food system. Our largest project, however, is D-Town Farm, which is a 7-acre organic farm in a city-owned park. We have a 10-year license agreement with the city of Detroit. We grow more than 30 different crops. And some people claim that our collard greens, which are in the lower slide there, are the sweetest collard greens in Detroit. I don't know if that's true, but I'm buying it. Okay. We also had a huge problem with deer the first year we moved there. Bambi and her family had lived there for many years before we moved there, and so the first year before we got a deer fence put up, we had about 750 tomato plants and harvested less than 5 pounds of tomatoes. We have a deer fence now, so we've gotten that problem under control, and we're learning how to contend with the groundhogs now. Part of our work is reframing agriculture work as honorable work. Among American society in general, farming is not really seen as being honorable work. Very few parents say to their children, Johnny or Kwame, when you grow up, I want you to be a farmer, right? Any of your parents say that to you? I mean, it's not really held in high esteem, although, as I said in the beginning, we're dependent upon farmers for our work, so it should be held in very high esteem. But, so that's a problem in American society in general, but among people of African descent, we have an even more acute problem, and that is that we associate farm work with slavery, enslavement, with tenant farming of various sorts, including sharecropping. And so part of our work is reframing this work as an act of community self-determination so people don't feel like their labor is being exploited to enrich somebody else, but we're using it for our own advancement. We do policy work, and I'm going to run through these slides very quickly, and I'll just say that we wrote the City of Detroit's food security policy with input from others in the City of Detroit, and that policy addresses several areas. You can go to the Detroit Food Policy Council's website, and I'll give you the web address for that at the end of this presentation, and you can actually download the complete document. But it is being looked at in many places as a model of food policy councils because we have embedded into it seats to make sure that Detroit's grassroots community is represented and plays a leadership role in the policy council, and it's not co-opted by either big ag or by corporate interest. We do several things, again, which I won't go into in great detail right now. And then also we're in part of this initiative, Uprooting Racism, Planting Justice, which started as a workshop at the 2009 Bioneers Conference in Detroit by Lisa Richter, who at that time was with Earthworks Urban Farm, which Molly, if I recall, used to work with, and our current board president, Dr. Monica White. And so it has morphed into this organization where we meet monthly to discuss race in the food system, and I can say it's had a profound impact on some of the groups in Detroit doing urban agriculture work in terms of looking at how they enter community in a way that is more as a partner as opposed to coming with a missionary approach, and also it's impacted the hiring practices of some of the predominantly white nonprofits in the city of Detroit. So our organization, although we're called the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, we really support food sovereignty. And at the time we were formed, we weren't really familiar with this term, food sovereignty. but this really more correctly describes the work that we're doing, because we're concerned about not only food access, which is what food security addresses, but we're concerned about really communities having control of the food system that provides their food. So these are some of the principles of food sovereignty as put forth by Via Campesina, which is a peasant organization, or organization of people who work the land, which is a global organization, and we support all of these principles of food sovereignty, particularly the first one, that food is a basic human right. You have the right to have access to good, clean, healthy food, regardless of your economic standing. So embedded in this definition of food sovereignty are the concepts of food security, food justice, and environmental stewardship, all of which we think are very important. I've mentioned earlier that we're concerned about the economics of food, about extracting wealth from communities as they obtain food, and creating a system that allows that wealth to circulate in communities. And we're also concerned about how people are treated, that people be treated with dignity in the places that they go to purchase their food. But perhaps more importantly, we see food as a lens for this larger social justice effort, that there can't be food justice without social justice in society in general. So for us, food work is in many ways a lens or a frame that we use to activate people to become involved in this larger struggle for justice. So food justice is important. Food security and food sovereignty are important, but these are not separate from the other issues that plague American society. And we think that we need to work in concert with people working on issues like prisons and political prisoners and education and police brutality and all of the other kind of social ills that impact this society, because the root causes of all of those things are the same. So we have the responsibility of educating ourselves about those root causes that cause poverty, hunger, and oppression, and looking at how we address all of those, how we address the big picture. So if you'd like more information, I have a website that I do as part of my fellowship for the Institute for Agriculture Trade Policy. My website is www.beblackandgreen.com. And what I do on that site is I do interview black farmers, growers, and food activists around the country and post videos on the site. And I also have a blog that from time to time I'll put my views out on various topics. So I would highly encourage you to visit that site and to visit it often. Our organization, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network site, is www.detroitblackfoodsecurity.org. And if you like information on the Detroit Food Policy Council, including the City of Detroit's food security policy, and including the recently released 2011-2012 Detroit Food System Report, we put this out annually. You can get the first year's report or the second iteration of this report, which came out a few years ago, online. I would highly recommend that you read this and get a more in-depth understanding of the work that we're doing in the city of Detroit. So I'd like to end with the words of one of my favorite hip-hop groups, Dead Prez. Let's get free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malik.
Thank you very much.
That was terrific.
Thank you very much.
Before we open this up to questions, it's not quite the same as the cover of your wonderful report, but we have this photograph from our CSA.
Thank you.
And it says, presented to Malik Yakini, 13th Edward and Nancy Dodge Lecture, April 30th, 2013. Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future.
Thank you very much.
We hope that will decorate one of your many walls.
It will.
And remind you that we're all in this together.
Thank you very much.
And we thank you so much for the message you brought.
Humble. Thank
you. So, questions from the audience. Remember, this is being live streamed, so we need to have you on mic. So if you raise your hand, there will be somebody with a microphone for you.
Hi, have you, with the emergency manager situation, have you felt any effects of that on your farming? And
We
I did
haven't
notice
yet.
that you had 3 people from the government on your seat or something.
We haven't yet, and I would contend that what's happening is the kind of parameters of the powers of the emergency manager are being negotiated in the street as we speak. The governor has one idea of how it's going to go, but there's been so much pushback that they've tried to make a softer, gentler kind of emergency manager. And so shortly after being appointed, well, first of all, Michigan's law says, let me give you a little background. Okay, the people of the state of Michigan last year overwhelmingly voted out the Emergency Manager Act that allowed the governor to appoint emergency managers. However, the Republican-controlled House and Senate created a new bill that does essentially the same thing. So they had total disregard for the will of the people in the state of Michigan. And so under this new bill, he's appointed this manager. The bill says that as soon as an emergency manager is appointed, the salaries of the mayor and the city council go to zero. So this emergency manager was appointed. Within a day or two, he announced that he was going to restore the salaries of the mayor and the city council. And so my contention is that was in part in response to the major pushback that they're getting. And I would contend that there will continue to be some concessions as people resist this. And so we haven't seen yet any negative impact on urban agriculture or food system work as a result of the emergency manager, but we don't know what's going to manifest. One thing we're very concerned about is there's this huge amount of publicly owned land that the city owns in Detroit, 60,000 parcels, and typically what emergency managers do is they try to sell off the assets of the city to get cash. And so we're very concerned, and we're involved in this struggle about how publicly owned land is used, about what policies and practices guide that, about transparency, and about equity in the selling off of that land. So that's an area we're keeping a very close eye on. The Detroit Food Policy Council is very much involved in that, and in fact has issued a report, which is also on our website, recommendations on the sale of public land in the city of Detroit.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I work with urban farms here in Baltimore, and I really appreciate the lens that the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network brings to this work. We have certainly a somewhat diverse farming and gardening movement in the city, and I think that we have a lot more room for a discussion of race and class in the work we do. We have a lot of room to grow there. And I'm interested in a little bit more about how this first became so integrated into your movement, if it was really bringing in outside trainers or it was a couple people that got that conversation going, sort of like what was that?
Well, it was initiated because prior to, and I was sharing with Dr. Lawrence that prior to maybe 2005, I didn't really know there was a food movement, right? I mean, I was doing food stuff myself and, doing gardening and things, but I didn't know there was this larger movement. But I had been a movement activist in other aspects. I've been a black activist in many different ways, working on political prisoners, working against police brutality, working for economic justice, working for educational justice in many different arenas. And many of the people who founded our organization had a similar background. So we brought this activism to the food movement. And so we already had the conversation on race. I mean, that's what we were doing in these other arenas. So we just brought it with us kind of as we entered the food movement. So I would say that would be the initial point. But then also in 2006, I went through this dismantling racism training as part of the Community Food Security Coalition's conference in Vancouver. And so that's the first time I've been through a formal anti-racist training. That was very eye-opening for me, even though I had studied race for, maybe 40 years prior to that. And so we began to talk about how we could bring some kind of formal anti-racist training to Detroit, and those discussions really started taking place between our organization and Earthworks Urban Farm. And so now those trainings take place twice a year. We have a level 1 training, which is going, in fact, we have a training this weekend that I'm going to miss, and then we have a level 2 training for people who are a little more advanced. And so now we're seeing the effects of this kind of filter out into various organizations. And within organizations, they're doing what we call a power analysis to really look at within this movement who holds the power and how we might ensure that that power is invested in community and not only in large nonprofits.
So Malik, I have a question for you about some of the strategies you've used to engage citizens in public policy. And I'm guessing that that last sentence has something to do with that. But can you talk a little bit about how have you been able to, reach out to a lot of the citizens in Detroit and do that work effectively?
Well, let me start by saying that in terms of the policy work, that we realize we're not reaching as deeply as we need to. And so in all the organizations I participate in, I'm probably the #1 critic. Let me start by saying that. But the Detroit Food Policy Council, we hold an annual summit that we call Powering Up the Local Food System. And so we had the third one just this past month. And so we make huge efforts to get common everyday Detroiters out, including making buses available to pick people up, having buses at schools to bring youth, because again, we realize we have to have young people involved in this movement, having separate tracks just for youth that come to the conference. But also, it didn't happen this year, but in the previous years, we paid people to be community organizers, to actually go out and reach grassroots folks and bring them in, because it's very difficult. And what I found is that I'll speak on the Black community, that's what I'm most familiar with. The typical means that we use to organize, sending out things by email, flyers, text messages, they're not effective. And so in the community I live in, what's most effective is eyeball-to-eyeball contact and building trust with people and building it over a period of time. For some folks, you might have to talk to them 2 or 3 years before finally, they say, well, where's that meeting you were talking about? But so it requires that kind of consistency and relationship building. So those are the kind of strategies that we've used. But even given that, we have not reached as deeply or broadly as we need to. So that's one of the criticisms that myself and the current chair of the Detroit Food Policy Council have, and we're really looking at how we do that in a more robust way.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
I will definitely be pursuing an anti-racism training. I think that's a great idea.
Great.
And I'm constantly struggling with how to frame race in studying public health and in studying the food system and trying to do my part to start that dialogue constantly, which has challenges of its own.
Absolutely.
I wanted to get back to that idea of a colonized mind, which I think is really powerful. And I would argue that we have that not just in terms of race, but in terms of class, in terms of what it means to have, a successful life and a good standard of living. And I would love to see a dialogue not just about poverty and about who holds the resources, which are extremely important conversations, but also in terms of how people perceive success. And how much people think that they need to be successful. And, you touch on farming as an honorable profession, and I think that's a major hurdle, is just perceived standard of success. And so I'm wondering if you have that dialogue at all with the young people in your community, or if you're thinking about the colonized mind in terms of class as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll start my response by quoting Grace Lee Boggs, who's a Detroiter that many people are familiar with. She's 95 years old and has been involved in many manifestations of movement work. But she says that we have to live more simply so that others can simply live. And so we have this gross consumer culture in America, and in much of the world, in fact, where there's this idea that the goods produced in the Western countries are superior to goods produced by indigenous populations. And so there's status attached to these things. You have people, going into debt to buy things they don't need. So we have extensive discussion about consumer culture and about pushing back, about living simply, about building more resilient communities by consuming less and producing more. And so that's very much a part of the work that we're doing, very much part of the dialogue. Thank you for raising that. And also, I would just suggest, I'm glad that you are going to go through an anti-racist training. I just want to say to you and everyone else, that's not a one-time shot, that it's an ongoing process. I've been through maybe 4 myself, and I'm still, each time I go through one, I'm still learning.
Hi, Kellogg Schwab, great talk. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. I really
Thank you very
appreciate it. I got a comment that maybe could end up in a question, and it goes to what you were just describing as how this challenge of race and coming through. And I wrote down in the beginning, priming the whites. But it's clear that there's this need that you've effectively developing a communication strategy, not to alienate people. And comes to mind is Upton Sinclair wrote a book in 1906 called The Jungle, where he was going into a socialistic approach, but got to people through their stomachs. It was about the meat packing process and how just atrocious it was. And ended up into regulations, actually. Down the road, there actually was this kind of building up of, wait, things have gotten too bad. Let's do something about that as a collective humanity. And so I can see this process that you're developing. And what I'd like to ask is that...
Let me suggest that I'm not developing it. I'm a participant. Many people are collectively developing
Right. The idea of eyeball to eyeball. And what we're struggling with here in the School of Public Health, and particularly in public health, is dissemination of information in appropriate ways. And we're working on these techniques called mobile health and mobile wash, which is water sanitation, and using the new mechanisms of communication that can hit a broad audience with appropriate, tweet was part of that as well. How do you see integrating that in a way that can be sustainable so that we can continue on to develop these processes and learn from it too? Make it a two-way way that we can gauge what's coming out from the community to help empower them to push the right way for food and for better choices in food, and how we get community involvement on that.
Well, I'm all for the use of social media, and I tweet and I do Facebook and I do all that stuff, but there's lots of people who don't. And I was talking to a friend in Asheville last night, one of these farmers in what's called the Hillcrest Public Housing Development. I guess they don't call them projects anymore. In fact, somebody criticized me the other day for saying this. I'm trying to not use that word, but in the Hillcrest Housing Development. And so, I'm trying to help her get funding, and I sent her a link on a grant, and she said, well, my laptop is down, so I can't really get to it. And so there's all kind of problems where people don't have access to social media. So I think we need to use social media in a robust way. We just need to use other means as well. And so what I found is that the most effective means is really talking directly to people and people trusting you. A lot of this is relationship building. They have to know who you are, know that you're not there to exploit them. Many times people are paranoid, and rightfully so, because we have so many people coming to our communities with so many, ideas that are going to change things around, and we see no impact. And so many times when another program comes, people are suspicious. And so it takes a while to really develop that rapport with people. And so I found that consistency over time is extremely important. So, we need to use the social media, yes, but we don't need to exclusively use social media. We still need to rely on some of the old style organizing that reaches people directly at their homes or their churches or in community centers or on the street even.
So I think with that, we'll close this formal part, and the eyeball-to-eyeball connecting with Malik Yakini can take place out in the courtyard over a vegan lunch. Thank you again. It was wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for the opportunity.